Hello, and welcome to GreyNoise University. I'm Brad Chiappetta, and this module is part of our GreyNoise API and CLI training series. In this module, we'll be covering the GNQL Stats endpoint and reviewing examples. The GNQL Stats endpoint is used to ask questions or query the GreyNoise Internet Scanner dataset and get a summarized overview of the results of that query. The endpoint allows queries to be submitted using the same GreyNoise query language searches that the GreyNoise visualizer uses. The GNQL documentation provides a full list of all the fields that can be used to query, along with some examples. You can also use the GreyNoise visualizer to build a query syntax off of common attributes. If I click on the Today link, and then click on some classification, and then perhaps click on a destination, you can see that the search bar now includes the proper query syntax. The GNQL Stats endpoint uses a GET request and requires a query value in the input to function correctly. The query parameter gets appended to the API URL. Because of this, it is important to ensure that the query is properly encoded. The API reference page will provide an example of how this works. For example, when we enter the query we created in the visualizer on the reference page, then view the request in the sample, we can see the encoded values for things like spaces, which is a %20, and colons, which is a %3a. For usage monitoring, this endpoint consumes one search for each request. The endpoint will return a status code of 200, meaning the request was successful and the query was submitted, a 400, meaning there was an error in the request, such as an invalid query or parameter being sent to the endpoint, a 401, meaning the API key was not valid, or a 429 if the daily rate limit was reached. If we click the Try It button, we can review the endpoint response based on the query provided. In addition to the required parameter, there is also an additional optional parameter, count. The count parameter takes in an integer value between 1 and 10,000 and is used to limit the number of options included in the summarize section. For example, if the summary response includes 10 options for a specific query, the count is set to 5, only the top 5 entries based on the total count for each will be returned. Let's run the query in a CLI by copying the curl command from the API docs and pasting it into our terminal. I'm also going to use a tool called JQ to help make the output easier to read. In the response, you can see at the top level we get some basic information about the query submitted, including what the query was, a count of IPs that the query returns, and a stats section. The stats section includes sub-objects for each of the different summary types, including things like source country, organization, and classification. For each category, a count and value are provided so that you'll be able to see, for example, how many IPs matched each classification type. This concludes the training module. If you have any questions on the topics covered, please reach out to support@greynoise.io.